October 1944. The air in the camp was a fine, gritty dust that coated the back of the throat and settled in the folds of their drab utilitarian uniforms. It was the dust of a vast, indifferent continent, a world away from the damp, moss-scented earth of the fatherland they had been raised to deify and defend. They had been told the Americans were a mongrel race, soft and decadent, a nation of shopkeepers playing at war, their power a fragile illusion built on gold stolen from others. For months behind the wire fences of Camp Forrest, Tennessee, the women of the Wehrmachthelferinnenkorps and other captured German auxiliaries had clung to this catechism. It was the final armor against the slow, grinding humiliation of defeat. They were soldiers, even in their worn-out shoes and thinning jackets, and they would face their captors with the unyielding stoicism their ideology demanded. The women moved through their days in a haze of practiced discipline and simmering contempt. They were a microcosm of the Reich, a collection of radio operators, clerks, anti-aircraft gun assistants, and nurses, now reduced to the common denominator of prisoner of war. There was Ilse, whose father was a party official in Munich, her eyes still holding the cold fire of true belief, her posture an unbent rod of defiance. There was Greta, a nurse from Hamburg, who had seen things in the field hospitals that had chipped away at her faith long before the Americans ever had. And there was Anneliese, barely 20, a former student from Berlin whose patriotism was more a product of youthful fervor than deep-seated conviction, her fear now a constant low hum beneath the surface of her composure. They saw the American Guards, young men, often boys, who chewed gum with a lazy rhythm and treated their duties with a shocking lack of theatrical severity, and saw weakness. They were given 3 meals a day, food that was bland and monotonous but always sufficient, and they interpreted this not as decency but as a calculated effort to fatten them up, to soften their resolve before the inevitable, brutal interrogations that propaganda had promised them. Their world had been forged in the crucible of scarcity and sacrifice. They knew the metallic taste of ersatz coffee, the dense, sawdust-like texture of wartime bread, the virtue of a clean plate when millions went hungry. They understood a society organized around the central immovable pillar of the state, where every action was weighed for its utility to the collective, to the glorious struggle. Their communities were the party, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the regiment. Loyalty was an order, not a choice. Compassion was a resource to be allocated primarily to those who shared their blood and their creed. The idea of a society built on anything else, on individual whims, on a chaotic and inefficient concept like freedom, on a sentimental notion of kindness, was not only foreign, but inherently laughable. It was a structural flaw, a genetic weakness in the American character that would, in time, lead to its inevitable collapse. They waited for the mask to slip, for the lazy guards to show their true, brutal nature, for the veneer of civility to crack and reveal the depraved chaos they knew lay beneath. But the brutality they were braced for never arrived, replaced by something far more unsettling, a quiet, baffling, and utterly alien proposition. What they were about to witness would not break their bodies, but it would shatter the very foundations of their world. If you find these hidden stories of history as fascinating as we do, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. It came not in the form of an order barked by a stern-faced officer, but as a suggestion, almost an afterthought, delivered by the camp's Protestant chaplain, a mild-mannered man named Miller, whose German was halting but sincere. He spoke to a small group of them during a routine inspection, his hands clasped awkwardly behind his back. He mentioned that a local church, the First Baptist of Tullahoma, was hosting its weekly service and a community supper afterwards. The pastor, he explained, had extended an invitation. Any of the women who wished to attend would be provided transportation. They would be guests, not prisoners, for the evening. The chaplain smiled, a gesture that did not reach his weary eyes, and then he simply walked away, leaving the offer hanging in the dusty air like a strange, impossible fruit. The women stared after him, then at each other, their faces a mixture of suspicion and disbelief. Ilse was the first to speak, her voice a low, venomous hiss. It was a trap, obviously, a pathetic propaganda display. They would be paraded in front of cameras, photographed for American newspapers under headlines like "Nazi prisoners find God and democracy." They would be forced to sing enemy hymns, to listen to sermons about the evils of their own nation, to perform contrition for the eager consumption of the local populace. It was a psychological trick, a more insidious form of interrogation designed to break their morale where simple confinement had failed. She would have none of it. She would rather rot in this dusty pit than participate in such a cheap, degrading spectacle. Her words were a rallying cry, and many of the older, more indoctrinated women nodded in grim agreement. Greta the nurse was less certain. She was a pragmatist, a woman who dealt in the tangible realities of blood and bone, not in the lofty abstractions of ideology. The camp was a universe of crushing monotony. The same dust, the same food, the same barbed wire, day after endless day. The offer, even if it was a trap, was at least a disruption. It was a chance to see beyond the wire, to breathe different air, to observe the enemy in his natural habitat. What was the worst that could happen? They would be mocked. They had endured far worse. Annalise, the youngest, remained silent, torn between Ilse's rigid certainty and a desperate, unspoken curiosity. The word supper had lodged in her mind. A community supper. What could that even mean? She imagined a thin soup and more of the same dense, tasteless bread, served with a side of moralizing lectures. Yet the thought of leaving the camp even for a few hours was a powerful lure. The risk felt secondary to the promise of a simple change of scenery. The debate raged for 2 days, a quiet but intense civil war fought in the hushed confines of their barracks. It was a test of loyalties, a measure of their resolve. To go was to show weakness, to entertain the enemy's overtures. To stay was to uphold the honor of a nation that, by all accounts, was now little more than a pile of smoldering rubble. In the end, it was not ideology, but sheer soul-crushing boredom that made the decision for them. Enjoying this deep dive into a forgotten corner of World War II? Click the like button to let us know, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. On the following Sunday, a group of 12 women, a silent and wary delegation, boarded an olive drab army truck. Ilse was among them, her face a mask of stone. She had decided to go not out of weakness, but to act as a witness, to document the enemy's methods of psychological warfare and report back. Greta was there, her observant eyes taking in every detail. Annalise sat beside her, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The truck rumbled out of the camp gates, and the first shock was the landscape. They had been prepared for a nation of towering steel cities and decadent urban sprawl, as the newsreels had shown. They were not prepared for this endless, rolling green, the small, tidy farms with their white fences, the trees heavy with late autumn leaves. The sheer, unscarred peace of it all was a physical blow. Their own homeland was a monochrome landscape of ash and ruin, a constant open wound. This place was whole. The town of Tullahoma was another assault on their senses. There were no checkpoints, no soldiers on the street corners, no visible signs of a nation at total war. The houses were made of wood, painted in cheerful colors, each with its own small patch of green lawn. Children played on the sidewalks. A dog barked. It was a portrait of such profound and ordinary normalcy that it felt like a hallucination. They had been taught that America was a society rotting from within, torn apart by racial strife and capitalist greed, its strength a hollow shell. But the town they saw through the rattling frame of the truck was placid, orderly, and eerily prosperous. The women exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the America they had been prepared for. This picture-perfect scene felt more staged, more dishonest than any propaganda film. The truck stopped in front of a simple white building with a modest steeple, the First Baptist Church. It was not a grand stone cathedral like the ones in Cologne or Munich, monuments to centuries of power and glory. It was a humble, almost fragile-looking structure of wood and glass. As they disembarked, escorted by 2 unarmed guards who looked profoundly uncomfortable, the church doors opened. A small crowd of people, the congregation, stood on the steps. They were farmers, mechanics, housewives, and shopkeepers, their faces weathered by sun and work. There was a moment of thick, awkward silence. The Germans stood stiffly, a small island of gray uniforms in a sea of colorful Sunday best. They braced themselves for jeers, for glares of hatred, for the righteous anger of a people whose sons were fighting and dying overseas. They were the enemy, the embodiment of a monstrous ideology. They were prepared to be reviled. Instead, a short, balding man in a slightly too tight suit, the pastor, stepped forward and smiled, extending a hand. He spoke a few words of welcome, which the chaplain translated, and then the other people began to move. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They nodded. Some of the women offered small, hesitant smiles. A few of them murmured greetings. They were being treated not with hostility, but with a kind of awkward, formal politeness, the way one might treat a strange and unexpected distant relative who had shown up for dinner. This gentle, baffling welcome was more disarming than any threat could ever have been. This is just the beginning of their story. To support our channel and help us create more in-depth historical content like this, consider becoming a patron through the link in the description. They were led inside into a sanctuary filled with simple wooden pews and the faint scent of floor polish and old hymnals. The service itself was a strange experience. The music was not the soaring, magnificent organ music of a Lutheran cathedral, but something more rhythmic, more emotional. The congregation sang with a startling lack of restraint, their voices full and earnest. The sermon was passionate, full of references to grace and redemption that, in translation, seemed to be directed as much at the congregation as at the German prisoners. Ilse sat rigid, analyzing every word for hidden propaganda, for coded messages of indoctrination. Greta observed the faces of the Americans, noting the genuine emotion, the tears in one woman's eyes, the fervent concentration on a farmer's face. Anneliese found herself simply overwhelmed by the strangeness of it. The cultural dissonance so profound, it was almost paralyzing. But the true shock, the moment that would recalibrate their entire understanding of the enemy, came after the service. The congregation moved from the sanctuary into a large, brightly lit basement hall. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat, baking bread, and something sweet and cinnamon-scented. Down the center of the room, several long tables had been pushed together and were now groaning under the weight of food. It was a mountain of food, a landscape of astonishing abundance. There were platters piled high with fried chicken, golden and crisp. There were massive bowls of potato salad, creamy and dotted with herbs. There were casseroles of every description, baked beans, glistening ears of corn, fresh baked rolls with pats of yellow butter melting on top. And that was just the main course. A separate table was dedicated entirely to desserts, towering layer cakes with thick frosting, fruit pies with latticed crusts, plates of cookies, and shimmering, colorful gelatin molds. The German women simply stopped and stared. Their minds, conditioned by years of rationing and deprivation, could not process the scene. This wasn't a state banquet for high-ranking officials. This was a simple Sunday supper in a small, unimportant town in the middle of nowhere, and the sheer, casual, thoughtless profusion of it was an act of violence. It was an assault. Ilse's first thought was that it had to be a trick. This food must have been requisitioned, gathered from the entire region for this one single performance, all for their benefit. It was the most elaborate piece of propaganda yet. No society, not even one as reputedly wealthy as America, could sustain this level of waste, this decadent surplus, especially not in the midst of a world war. She scanned the room, looking for the hidden cameras for the government officials overseeing the charade. She saw only the townspeople laughing and talking as they filled their plates. A woman with a kind, wrinkled face, the pastor's wife, approached them holding a stack of plates. She smiled and gestured towards the tables, an unambiguous invitation. Anneliese looked at the fried chicken, and her stomach clenched with a hunger so deep and so long suppressed it was almost painful. She remembered her last real meal in Berlin before the nightly bombings began, a thin slice of pork that was a rare and precious treasure. Here, a mountain of meat was being offered to her, the enemy, by a smiling civilian. Greta, the nurse, saw not just food, but calories, protein, fat. She saw the raw materials of health and strength, lavished here in a quantity that could have fed a field hospital for a week. She looked at the healthy, well-fed children running through the hall and then thought of the gaunt, hollow-eyed children of Hamburg. The contrast was of physical sickness in the pit of her stomach. The feast was not an act of generosity. It was a declaration of a power so vast and incomprehensible it defied all their known metrics of warfare. These stories are often lost to time. By sharing this video with a friend, you help keep them alive. Let's make sure these perspectives are not forgotten. The women moved as if in a trance, accepting plates and allowing the American women to heap them with food. They sat at a table designated for them, and for a long time they were silent, the sounds of their own chewing unnaturally loud in their ears. The food was real. The chicken was juicy. The potatoes were rich. The cake was sweet. Every bite was a confirmation of a terrifying truth. This was not a performance. This was real life. This was normal. A young boy, no older than 10, approached their table, shyly offering a plate of freshly baked cookies. He held it out to Ilsa. She stared at him, at his clean clothes, his well-fed face, his utter lack of fear. In her world, children were taught to hate the enemy, to spy on them, to wish for their destruction. This child was offering her a cookie. She didn't know what to do. She froze, her entire ideological framework short-circuiting in the face of this small, simple gesture. Greta gently took a cookie from the plate and thanked the boy in broken English, and he scampered away. Ilsa watched the boy go, and a cold dread washed over her. She finally understood. The trap was not that this was propaganda. The trap was that it wasn't. This was the authentic face of the enemy. A people so obscenely wealthy, so insulated from the horrors of the war they were waging, that they could afford to extend Christian charity and homemade pies to their sworn enemies. The Reich demanded total sacrifice from its people. Every gram of butter, every ounce of steel, every drop of fuel was consecrated to the war effort. Hardship was a sacrament. Here, in this church basement, abundance was treated as an afterthought. It was a byproduct of a system so powerful, so mind-bogglingly productive, that it generated this surplus without even trying. They weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting an entire civilization that operated on a different plane of reality. The experience was repeated the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. They were taken to a Methodist church, then a Presbyterian one. The names and the faces changed, but the ritual was unnervingly the same. The awkward welcome, the earnest service, and then the inevitable staggering feast in the basement. Each time the display of food seemed more impossible than the last. Each time the casual kindness of the congregants seemed more alien. The women in the camp who had initially been skeptical began to grow curious, and the group that went to church grew larger. They began to understand that this was not a special event for their benefit. It was a systemic, widespread, and entirely commonplace feature of American life. The cognitive dissonance became a constant, throbbing pressure in their minds. The world as they knew it was a lie. The foundational truths they had been taught about their own superiority and the enemy's weakness were being dismantled, one slice of pie at a time. Their conversations in the barracks at night began to change. The defiant, angry rhetoric quieted, replaced by hushed, bewildered questions. How was it possible? Where did all this food come from? Why were these people not filled with a righteous hatred for them? They began to compare the reality of this small Tennessee town with the Germany they had left behind. They spoke of the ration lines that snaked for blocks, of the bitter arguments over a few withered potatoes, of the joyless, state-mandated holidays. They recalled the grim, determined faces on the streets of Berlin, the pervasive fear of the Gestapo, the way neighbors spied on neighbors. They had been told this was the price of strength, the necessary sacrifice for purity and greatness. But the strength they saw here was of a different kind. It was a relaxed, confident strength, a power that did not need to shout or threaten. It was the strength of a people who had so much they could afford to give it away. The realization began to dawn that their nation had not been outfought on the battlefield. It had been outproduced, outorganized, and outlived in the church basements of its enemy. Think this story is unique? You'd be surprised what else is buried in the archives. Subscribe and join our community of history detectives as we dig deeper. The psychological impact was devastating, a slow-acting poison to their morale. For women like Ilsa, it was a daily torment. Her entire identity was built on the belief in the superiority of the National Socialist system. It was, she had been taught, the most efficient, most just, most powerful form of social organization ever conceived. It had eliminated unemployment. It had built the Autobahn. It had restored German pride. But that system, for all its vaunted efficiency, could not provide butter for its people's bread. This chaotic, messy, individualistic American system, which she had been taught was weak and decadent, produced a surplus so vast that its citizens didn't even seem to notice it. They gave it away to their enemies as a casual afterthought. Every polite smile, every heaping spoonful of potato salad was a refutation of her entire life's creed. It was a profound and constant humiliation. For Greta, the experience was less about ideology and more about a dawning terrible clarity. As a nurse, she had been a functionary in a system that treated human beings as resources. A soldier was a unit of fighting strength. A factory worker was a unit of production. A wounded man was a debit to be repaired or discarded. The logic was brutal and efficient. Here, she saw a different logic at play. These people were not organized by the state. They gathered voluntarily. They cooked food, not because they were ordered to, but because it was what one did. They showed kindness not because it served a strategic purpose, but because their faith, however strange it seemed to her, commanded it. She saw a community that was organic, self-sustaining, and built from the bottom up. The Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community that Goebbels had endlessly extolled, was a top-down creation, a fantasy enforced by propaganda and secret police. This church basement was the real thing, and it was held together by nothing more than shared belief and casserole recipes. Annalise, the youngest, experienced the shift most acutely. Her patriotism had been a thing of songs, parades, and thrilling speeches. The war had been an adventure, a grand and noble cause. Now the grand cause had shrunk to the size of a prison camp, and the adventure had soured into a grim reality. The American church suppers did not offer her a new ideology to replace the old one. They offered something far more potent, a glimpse of a life she had never known was possible. A life without constant fear, without gnawing hunger, without the suffocating presence of the state in every aspect of one's existence. For the first time, she began to see her own country, not through the lens of propaganda, but through the eyes of an outsider. She saw the fanaticism, the cruelty, the self-defeating pride. One evening, a woman about her own mother's age showed her a picture of her son, a young soldier serving in the Pacific. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she spoke of her fear for him. In that moment, the American woman was not the enemy. She was a mother, terrified for her child, just like the mothers in Berlin. The official, state-sanctioned hatred Annalise had been taught to feel evaporated, replaced by a simple, devastating human connection. The weekly excursions became a form of psychological torture. The women would return to the camp, their stomachs full of rich food, and the bland, boiled potatoes of their prison dinner would seem like an insult. The gray, dusty confines of the camp would feel more oppressive than ever. They were living in a paradox, physically confined but mentally liberated into a new and terrifying understanding of the world. They were prisoners of a nation whose greatest weapon was not its bombs or its tanks, but its abundance, its confidence, and its baffling, infuriating kindness. They had been prepared to die for their country, to face down a brutal and degenerate enemy. They had not been prepared to be defeated by cherry pie. The war for them was no longer a question of victory or defeat on the battlefield. It was a matter of reconciling the world they had been promised with the one they had discovered. The enemy had not conquered them with force. He had dismantled their reality with a simple act of hospitality. What do you think was the most powerful part of this cultural shock? The food, the kindness, or the normalcy? Let us know your perspective in the comments section below. The core of their ideology rested on a foundation of heroic struggle against a hostile world. Germany, they were taught, was a nation besieged, denied its rightful place in the sun by jealous and inferior powers. Every sacrifice was noble. Every act of aggression was a justified defense. The German people were a master race, destined for greatness, their superiority proven by their willingness to endure hardship. This narrative was the engine of the entire war machine. It fueled the soldiers at the front and the workers in the factories. It gave meaning to the hunger, the bombings, and the endless lists of the dead. It was a story of Spartan strength against decadent, materialistic foes. And in the bright, food-laden basements of Tennessee churches, that story was being systematically unwritten exposed as a pathetic and tragic lie. The materialism they had been taught to despise was not the weakness they had imagined. It was the source of an unimaginable strength. A nation that could produce this much food, this much consumer goods, this much simple, everyday prosperity, while simultaneously waging a two-front global war was not decadent. It was a leviathan. It was an industrial and organizational titan of a scale their own leaders could not possibly have comprehended. The German war effort was a marvel of improvisation and ruthless efficiency, but it was always brittle, always on the edge of collapse, always one shortage away from disaster. The American war effort, it seemed, was fueled by the nation's spare change, its leftover capacity. The women began to understand that Germany had never stood a chance. It had brought a knife to a fight with a force of nature. This realization brought with it a complex and bitter cocktail of emotions. There was a deep, burning shame. They felt like primitives who had stumbled into the land of giants, their own fierce pride and tribal certainties suddenly rendered absurd. They had believed themselves to be the pinnacle of civilization, and now they saw that in many of the ways that mattered for a normal life, they were citizens of a failed state, a nation that had sacrificed its people's well-being on the altar of a mad and unattainable ambition. There was envy, a raw and powerful jealousy of the simple, peaceful lives these Americans led. They envied the food, the safety, the undamaged homes, but most of all, they envied the lightness of being, the freedom from the constant, crushing weight of ideology and fear. But beneath the shame and the envy, something else began to grow, a grudging, unwilling respect. It was not respect for the American soldier, whom they still often regarded as poorly disciplined and soft. It was respect for the system that produced him, a system that could create such abundance, that could foster such strong voluntary communities, and that could possess a confidence so profound that it did not need to brutalize its captured enemies. They began to see that the fanatical discipline and iron-willed hardness they had been taught to worship were not signs of strength, but symptoms of a deep-seated national insecurity. A truly strong nation, a truly confident people, did not need to scream about its own superiority. Its power was self-evident. It was visible in the laden tables of a church potluck. It was audible in the easy laughter of its citizens. Ilse fought this realization with every fiber of her being. She tried to find the cracks in the facade. She looked for signs of the racial strife she had been told was tearing America apart. She listened for whispers of dissent, of war weariness, of resentment. But in the small, homogeneous world of rural Tennessee, she found little to confirm her biases. She saw a society that, on the surface at least, was cohesive, optimistic, and united. She began to turn her anger inward, directing it at her own leaders. They had lied to her. They had lied to the entire German people. They had led them into a catastrophic war they could never hope to win, armed with a worldview that was a fragile fantasy. Her faith, once a granite fortress, was crumbling into dust, and she did not know what, if anything, would be left in its place. The cold fire in her eyes began to dim, replaced by a look of haunted confusion. The psychological defeat was now complete, long before the official surrender was ever signed. If this story has changed the way you think about the nature of warfare, consider sharing it. Spreading knowledge is the first step to understanding. The culmination of this slow, agonizing transformation did not come in a single dramatic moment of epiphany. It was a quieter, more profound shift, a final internal click of a tumbler in a lock. It happened for many of the women during a Christmas Eve service. They had been in the camp for over a year. The war in Europe was in its final bloody death throes. They knew their country was being pounded into submission, their families scattered or worse. Despair was a constant companion. The invitation to a midnight service felt less like a novelty and more like a somber obligation. They went, expecting another dose of baffling American cheerfulness, which felt particularly galling in the face of their own private grief. The church was decorated with pine boughs and candles. The air smelled of wax and cold winter air. The service was different this time. It was quieter, more solemn. They sang carols, and the Germans were startled to hear familiar melodies. Stille Nacht, O Tannenbaum, sung in English. The familiar tunes were a painful reminder of home, of Christmases past, of a world that no longer existed. Annalise began to weep silently, hiding her face in her hands. Even Ilse felt a lump form in her throat. The shared music transcended the language barrier, the uniforms, the war itself. For a few minutes, they were not enemies, but simply people caught in the grip of a cold and lonely Christmas far from home. After the service, there was no boisterous feast in the basement. Instead, the congregation served hot coffee and small, simple sugar cookies. The pastor moved among the prisoners, speaking to them quietly through the chaplain. He did not speak of victory or defeat, of sin or righteousness. He spoke of hope. He spoke of peace. He told them that they were praying for them and for their families back in Germany. He said that they prayed for an end to all wars. It was this moment, this simple, unadorned expression of empathy, that finally broke through the last of their defenses. Propaganda could be dismissed. Abundance could be rationalized as a strategic asset. But this quiet, genuine expression of shared humanity was irrefutable. In that moment, the women understood the true nature of American power. It was not just the factories or the endless fields of wheat. It was not the tanks or the aircraft carriers. Those were merely the symptoms. The true source of its strength was a cultural and philosophical one. It was a society that, for all its flaws and contradictions, was built upon a fundamental belief in the value of the individual, in the power of voluntary community, and in a concept of grace that could extend even to one's enemies. The church, the potluck, the kindness, they were all expressions of this core principle. It was a principle that was antithetical to their own ideology, which saw the individual as expendable, community as something to be enforced by the state, and grace as a weakness to be exploited. They had been taught that the ultimate expression of national strength was a glorious death on the battlefield, a heroic sacrifice for the fatherland. They now saw that a far greater, more enduring strength was expressed in a group of ordinary people baking cookies for their enemies on Christmas Eve. One was a philosophy of death, the other a philosophy of life. And in the final accounting, the philosophy of life, backed by an industrial machine of unimaginable scale, would always win. It was not a military victory they were witnessing, but a civilizational one. Their entire worldview, predicated on hardness, struggle, and the will to power, had been rendered obsolete by a society that had weaponized softness, generosity, and community. It was the most profound and humbling defeat imaginable. Ilse looked at the pastor, at the earnest, simple faces of the congregation, and for the first time she did not see weakness or decadence. She saw a power she could not name, a force she knew her own broken nation could never have hoped to overcome. They had come to America as soldiers of a master race. They would leave as witnesses to its fundamental and catastrophic miscalculation. This is the kind of history that changes perspectives. If you believe in the importance of these stories, help support our work on Patreon. Every contribution makes a difference. The war in Europe ended. The news arrived at the camp as a dispassionate official announcement. A confirmation of what they had all known for months was inevitable. There was no great outpouring of grief among the women. The grief had been a slow leak, not a sudden flood. Their defeat had already happened, not in the ruins of Berlin, but in their own minds. They were now simply waiting for the next chapter, for the return to a homeland they could no longer recognize, armed with a knowledge that would forever set them apart. The journey home was a reversal of their arrival, a slow passage from a world of color and plenty back into a world of gray and want. Repatriated to the British zone of occupation, they found a Germany that was even worse than they had imagined. The cities were lunar landscapes of rubble. The people were gaunt, spectral figures, their faces etched with a bone-deep weariness. Hunger was not a memory, but a constant, gnawing reality. The famed German order had collapsed into a desperate Darwinian struggle for survival. The women, who had complained about the monotony of their prison food, now dreamed of the bland potatoes and boiled vegetables of Camp Forrest as if they were a feast. The memory of the church suppers became a kind of surreal fantasy, a story they could scarcely believe themselves, let alone tell to their starving compatriots. How could you explain a table laden with a dozen different kinds of pie to someone who had not seen real butter in 5 years? The experience in America became a secret they carried within them, a private touchstone of a different reality. It had permanently altered their perspective. They could no longer summon the old reflexive hatreds. They could no longer believe in the grand, sweeping ideologies that promised utopia through violence and sacrifice. They had seen what a society could be when it was not animated by resentment and fear. They had tasted the fruits of a system built on a different set of assumptions about human nature. This knowledge was both a burden and a gift. It was a burden because it isolated them from their fellow Germans who had not seen what they had seen, who still clung to the old myths and excuses. It was a gift because it inoculated them against the political poisons that would continue to circulate in Germany for years to come. Ilse, the former true believer, lived a quiet life in the rebuilt Munich. She never spoke of politics. She never joined any party. When she heard the old nationalistic songs or the angry rhetoric of those who sought to revise the history of the war, she would simply walk away. Her certainty had been burned out of her, replaced by a profound and unshakable skepticism. She had seen the end result of absolute belief, and she wanted no more part of it. The memory of the boy with the cookies was a permanent fixture in her mind, a constant reminder of the complex, contradictory, and stubbornly human face of the enemy. She had been so sure she understood. Greta returned to nursing, working in clinics that treated the endless stream of refugees and the malnourished. She became known for her quiet competence and her almost defiant sense of compassion. She saw her work not as a patriotic duty, but as a simple human one. She had seen community in its purest form, not as a political slogan, but as a group of people sharing what they had with strangers. She tried, in her own small way, to replicate that spirit in the broken landscape of post-war Germany, to build something new from the ruins, based not on grand theories, but on simple acts of kindness. She would sometimes bake a cake for her patients, using the scarce ingredients she could find, a pale imitation of the towering creations she remembered from Tennessee, but a symbol nonetheless. Anneliese eventually married and raised a family. She taught her children a different history of the war than the one being taught in schools. She taught them about the horrors, but she also taught them about the baffling kindness she had encountered. She told them the story of the church suppers, of the endless food, of the people who prayed for their enemies. Her children found the story hard to believe, like a fairy tale, but for Anneliese it was the most real and important lesson of the war. It was the story of how her hatred had been undone, how her worldview had been irrevocably shattered and then slowly, painstakingly rebuilt on a new foundation. The experience had not made her an admirer of America necessarily. It had made her a lifelong enemy of the fanaticism, certainty, and ideological hatred that had led her own country to ruin. The memory was not just a memory, it was a moral compass, one that had been forged in the most unlikely of places. A series of church basements in the heart of the enemy's land, where the war was lost and a new, more complicated understanding of the world was won.